Hi everyone, I'm Mary SanGiovanni, and today I'm going to be reading from Behind the Door, which is one of the first books in the Kathy Ryan series. This book is now available for 99 cents on Amazon, and it's available in ebook and paperback format if you're interested in picking up the book. It's one of my favorite in the Kathy Ryan series, so I'm going to be reading chapter 1. So here it is, chapter 1 of Behind the Door. In the town of Zarephath, Pennsylvania, just past the Pennsylvania-New Jersey border and northwest of Dingman's Ferry, out by the Delaware Water Gap, there is a door. Many stories about it form a particularly colorful subset of the local lore of the town and its surrounding woods, streams, and lakes. Most of them relate the same essential series of events, beginning with a burden of no small psychological impact, progressing to a twilight trip through the southwestern corner of the woods near Zarephath, and arriving at a door. Numerous variations detail what exactly must be presented at the door and how. But ultimately, these stories end with an unburdening of the soul and, more or less, happy endings. It is said more or less because such endings are arbitrarily more or less agreeable to the individuals involved than the situations prior to their visit to the door of Zarephath. More times than not, the less wins out. There are some old folks in town, snow and storm cloud-haired sept and octogenarians, who sip coffee and people watch from the local diner, or gather on front porches at dusk or over the counter at Ed's Hardware to trade stories of Korea and Vietnam, and in one venerable case, World War II. And it's said they know a thing or two about that door. The old-timers remember the desperation of post-war addictions and nightmares, and what they used to call shell shock, of families they couldn't help wearing down or beating up or tearing apart, despite their best efforts to hold things together. They remember carrying burdens, often buried, but never very deeply, beneath their conscious thoughts, burdens that crawled their way up from oblivion and into nightmares and flashbacks when the darkness of booze or even just the night took over men who had once been children and who were expected to be men. They remember late-night pilgrimages to the forest on the outskirts of town, trekking miles through the rain or dark or frost-laced wind to find that door, and lay their sins and sorrows at its feet. And they remember that sometimes forgetting proved to be worse. The old women, too, remember bruises and battered faces and blackouts. They remember cheating husbands and cancers and unwanted pregnancies and miscarriages and daughters being touched where they shouldn't by men who should have protected them. The old women remember the door in Zarephath being a secret, almost sacred equalizer that older women imparted to younger women, a means of power passed from one group of whose hands were socially and conventionally tied to another. And they remember watching strong women fall apart under the weight of that power. And these old folks remember trying once to burn the door down, but of course that hadn't worked. The door in Zarephath won't burn because it isn't made of any wood of this earth, anything beholden to the voracious appetite of fire. It had an appetite of its own that night, and no one has tried to burn it down since. Rather, the old-timers have learned to stay away from it, for the most part, to relegate the knowledge of its location and its promises to the same dusty old chests in the mind that the worst of their stories are kept. There's an unspoken agreement that, as far as the door in Zarephath goes, the young people can fend for themselves. While the folks in Zarephath won't stop a person from using the door, they aren't usually inclined to help anyone use it. Not in the open, and not just anyone who asks about it. Behind some doors are rooms hidden for good cause, in places human beings were probably never meant to know about. Rooms never meant to be entered. And the old folks of Zarephath understand that, for reasons they may never know, they were given a skeleton key to one such room. There's a responsibility in that, the kind whose true gravity is maybe only recognized by those with enough years and experience and mistakes left behind to really grasp it. People often say the old folks' generation were stoic, used to getting by with very little and largely of a frame of mind not prone to histrionic anxiety or useless worry. People say it has to do with surviving the Depression and growing up in a simpler, more rugged time. But for the old folks in Zarephath, the strength of their fiber comes from what they remember and from what they have come to accept forgetting. It comes from what they no longer choose to lay before the door. To say the loss of Carrie's daughter Jessica had left a hole in her heart significantly understated the situation. It was more of a gaping maw in the center of her being, a hungry vortex that swallowed light and love, vibrancy and memory. It had swallowed her friendships early on. People, even the most well-meaning of them, rarely knew what to say when someone's child died. Telling her time would heal all wounds sounded trite. Telling her everything would be okay sounded patronizing. How could such an inescapable hollowness ever be okay? And telling her Jessica was in a better place might come across as the biggest bullshit of all. There was no way anyone could possibly know what lay beyond the walls of mortality, and given the circumstances, the suggestion came across as being rather insensitive anyway. There was nothing even the most eloquent and empathetic could say to take away a hurt like that. How are you holding up, they'd ask with that look on their faces, part discomfort and part superiority in being somehow removed from such a horrible thing. Maybe the urge to slap that look off their faces showed through in her weak smiles and tired eyes. Or maybe her attempts to speak of banalities that went nowhere were just the kind of nothing words that stalled relationships or even moved them backwards. It was easier for people to drop away couple by couple and then one by one. Eventually, those awkward meetings became fewer and farther between. The calls stopped coming, followed by the emails, and then eventually the texts petered off too. There were no further attempts to get her out of the house and reconnected with the world. She was a sinking ship, and they were bailing before they got sucked into her currents. It was clear in their eyes, in their voices. It was in the distance they put between her and them. She had been relegated to a kind of camp or colony for people who had undergone an awful tragedy, a thing they were thankfully unable to relate to in any meaningful way. That gaping maw had swallowed her job as well. Her boss had been gracious in granting her time off from the office. He'd given her weeks, a month, and then another. She had dipped into and then run dry her long-term disability time. And when she'd come back to the office, the Mondays and Fridays when she couldn't find a reason good enough to get out of bed looked bad. Her zoning out during production meetings looked bad. Her stacks of unfinished paperwork looked bad. She'd quit after enough "please close the door" conversations led her to believe that she was on the verge of being fired. It had swallowed her marriage, certainly. Stephen hadn't managed more than a few months in the house, the two of them passing each other like solemn ghosts from different eras, unseeing, unhearing, and unable to comfort each other in the grief that had overwhelmed them both. When he finally drifted away for good, out of the house and into an apartment in another state, he became no more than a name on divorce paperwork and a face in old pictures she tucked away in a box. She hadn't lasted much longer there in the house, amid the dust and empty picture frames. If Jessica's spirit had haunted the old house instead of her memory haunting Carrie, then it might have been more bearable. At least she'd be able to feel some presence of and closeness to her daughter. But the girl wasn't there, at least not so far as Carrie could tell. The girl had fled that house and that life, and wherever her soul was, it seemed far beyond Carrie's reach. So Carrie had fled that old house and life too. The problem was, although the new house in Zarephath was the only thing that had gone well in a long time, it didn't feel like home, not like the one with Jessica's room, plastered as it was with posters of smiling, clean-cut objects of innocent preteen crushes. Not like the one with Stephen's clothes on his side of the closet and his keys on the table by the front door. She supposed her sense of security and family had been engulfed by that gaping maw too. Finally, it had swallowed her sense of self. Her sleep was shot to hell, and the depression and anxiety had become so bad that who she was no longer existed without the meds. Carrie hated what the meds did to her. Rather, she hated what the lack of meds in her system did. First, there was the headache, a storm of pain that gusted not just around her head, but up her nose and through her sinuses, behind her eyes and down her throat. There was the heavy weight of heat that made her sweat, a sour kind of sweat that turned her stomach if she lifted an arm or turned her head toward her shoulder. Then came the dizziness, an offshoot of the headache, whose roots seemed to reach down into her arms, hands, and fingers, sucking the strength out of them and making them shake. Her eyes would narrow to a glare from the pain and fog. Within her chest, a growing sense of unease would turn into a panic, whose edges fluttered far from and untethered to any rational ground. It was during those times that the memories of Jessica hurt worst. In fact, there were so many memories that she was starting to forget what it was like not to hurt. She felt all these things the night before she found out about the door in Zarephath. It coincided with the 1-month mark in her new house, and perhaps more importantly, the eve of the 3rd anniversary of Jessica's passing. If it were possible, the pain was sharper and deeper and more all-consuming now than it had been in those nightmare blur first weeks right after finding Jessica's body. Losing someone, she thought, was like quitting an addiction. First there came the withdrawal pangs of the mental and physical sort, the ache of not being able to hear her laughter or footsteps on the stairs, to see her smile or hug her, smell the child hair smell. But in a way, the routine, the comfortable familiarity, was a much tougher part of the habit to break. Carrie found she still looked out for the school bus at 5 minutes to 3, still made sure the door was unlocked and checked the sidewalk for Jessica's approach from the bus stop. She still found herself sometimes at the bottom of the stairs to call her daughter down for dinner, or call up to tell her to brush her teeth and that Carrie would be up in a minute to tuck her little girl in. She still made lists of toys to buy her daughter for Christmas, still perused the Halloween costumes for something Jessica might like. She wasn't sure if those rote actions were her way of proving she was still there, still Mom, or if they meant she herself had become a shade stuck in an endless loop of repeating the past. That night before, as she bent over the dishwasher, she grabbed a handful of serrated knives by their blades. They pressed into the skin of her palms, cold but not hard enough to cut her. Her hand shook, and she dropped them to the counter with a clatter. She was due to have lunch the next afternoon with Cicely, the nice old lady next door and one of her only acquaintances in Zarephath, or anywhere at all anymore. They had planned on the Alexia Diner on Dingman's Turnpike, and over what had become their weekly coffee and hot open-faced turkey sandwiches, she intended to tell Cicely she was finished with life, with everything, with trying to fight the current to be normal, functional, and in the process of healing. She wasn't any of those things, and she couldn't pretend anymore. She was cocooned in her personal world of grief and simply saw no other ways to break free. And no amount of friends' well-meaning attentiveness or love or understanding, and no amount of her own swallowing of pain and indignation and unfairness could make up for it. The loss of Jessica felt like a fist crushing what was left of her heart in her chest, and she was simply finished. The guilt and the sadness were too much to carry alone. She had hidden the note from Stephen. She'd hidden it from everyone. It felt like the last thing, the only thing she could do to protect her precious daughter. She'd found it crumpled into a tight little ball in Jessica's fist. The girl's reasoning was suggested in a few neat lines of looping girlish script. She couldn't keep secrets anymore. There were so many, and she felt so guilty and embarrassed and even afraid. But mostly, she was exhausted. Carrie knew how she felt. She picked up one of the knives again, entertaining the kind of thought that had come to fill in those tight little end spaces where her mind let memories of Jessica trail off. End cap thoughts was how she'd come to think of them. This one was less refined than some of the others. It involved a lot of blood, a tubful, maybe, and the indignity of being found naked or maybe just in her underwear. Messy and embarrassing and probably painful, of cutting Her legs, while shaving and letting them slip back under the warm water, was any indication. Her almost 12-year-old daughter had done something and gone somewhere she had never been and could never have imagined, had lived a part of her life and ended it without her mother and father. And that seemed wrong. It seemed wrong that children that age should ever feel the need to take on adult things like that, especially alone. Carrie didn't want Jessica to be alone. And if Jessica could open that door to another plane of existence, then how could Carrie call herself a decent mother and yet not have the guts to follow? Carrie put down the knife. She talked to Cicely. Then she'd decide. People like Toby Vernon built entire lives and whole senses of self around lies. Lies were the brick and mortar that built cities, even empires, of good faith, goodwill, and human connection. Among the sharply honed senses of the predator was a toolbox of excuses and fabrications based on body language, expressions in the eyes, and tones of voice, wielded quickly and efficiently to achieve a result. Lies allayed fears or manipulated them, soothed guilt or exacerbated it. Of all the talents to protect and develop as a primary survival skill, lying was at the top of the list. And people like Toby were good at it. He was turning 40 that year, which meant he had spent the last 24 years since his conviction, incarceration, and release perfecting his ability to lie. He had learned to change like a chameleon. He could be charming, unassuming, unworthy of notice or comment. He was also selective and at times ruthless. It had been almost 2.5 decades gone by since he had been arrested or convicted of anything that had to do with children. However, his confidence, and with it some of his skill, had waned after the girl in Dingman's Ferry. It wasn't that he didn't know deep down, deeper than his lies and justifications could reach, that he hurt children. He had in the past tried to justify it as a necessary evil, a means of pain management or sedation or simply an inexorable addiction. He was not so deluded as to think the children were unaffected by his attentions. It had never been so clear to him, though, nor had it ever inspired such self-loathing as it had with that girl. Something changed after that. Toby had taken a good look at his life the last 4 decades or so and realized that all that perfected lying had never been perfect at all. He had never escaped his mother's belief that he was a monster, pure and simple, the kind that most of the rest of the world would see put down sooner than a rabid dog. It made him afraid of others as if he were somehow suddenly exposed. Mostly, it made him afraid of himself, a notion that he wasn't used to and didn't like at all. Toby had always wanted to be normal, to date regular adult women, to get married. When he'd realized, much to his disappointment, that his sexual attraction to pre-adolescent girls wasn't something he could outgrow or ignore, he'd resigned himself to what he was. In fact, he'd suppressed instead that sad, self-pitying hope of ever getting better. After the Dingman's Ferry girl, though, that need to feel normal reemerged, and it was almost, not quite, but almost as strong as the urges themselves. He didn't want to feel self-loathing every time he drove past a playground, or worry that the hawk eyes of watchful mothers in grocery stores were judging him with disapproval and hostility. He no longer wanted to feel that old familiar tension and discomfort throughout his body at the birthday parties of families and friends' children. There were only so many times one could park a half block or so from the middle school during recess and come home to a boil of lust and shame. Only so many uncomfortable drives home with a heart-on in his pants as the echoes of his mother's disgusted words in his head before it came time to admit to being at a crossroads. Down one way lay peace. There might never be redemption, but there might be some cosmic credit for and solace in having overcome the basest part of himself. Down the other way meant the risk that one day those little bloodied flower print panties were going to end up shoved down some slender, pretty little throat, or some fragile set of growing bones was going to break. He didn't want that, Lord knows. He didn't want it to come to that. He asked the gods behind the door to take the urges away. Edward Richter had told him about the door. He knew Ed from the hardware store where the old man had been working stocking shelves and ringing up purchases for the last 17 years. Ed was more than a familiar face around town, though Toby wasn't sure he could quite classify Ed as a friend. Ed shared the same affliction, a predilection for children, though his preference was for little boys. Toby had seen it right away, the familiar mannerisms and expressions and the wolfish look in the eyes, just as he supposed Ed had recognized the same in him. It was a tenuous bond between them, for hunting is a lone pastime and a lonely one. He and Ed got together once a month, usually at Ed's house, a small pale yellow bi-level on the edge of town out by the woods. They drank beers and vented about work or politics, or debated the merits of the Mets versus the Pirates. Sometimes they talked about their respective stints in jail. Sometimes they talked about children. But until that one night 3 weeks prior, Ed had never mentioned the door. No one had, in all the years Toby had lived in Zarephath. "Well, Ed," Toby had said that night in response to Ed's asking after his well-being, "I've hit a wall, I think." "In what way?" Ed cocked an eyebrow at him and sipped his beer. Toby shook his head. "I drove past the park yesterday. You know the one out on Miller Road by the firehouse?" Ed nodded. The flash in his eyes, imperceptible to anyone but a fellow predator, told Toby that Ed knew it well. "There was this little girl. She was sitting on top of the monkey bars with her feet dangling over, and the wind moving little blonde strands of her hair across her cheek. She was beautiful, Ed. I mean, stunning. I wanted her, but it was more than just wanting her. It wasn't enough just watching her." A small, uncomfortable smile passed over Ed's lips. It seldom is. "I wanted to hurt her, Ed." The older man looked up in surprise. "Oh?" "I don't know. It was not like the other times. It was more intense a feeling, more primal, savage. I never felt that before, at least not to that extent, you know?" "Can't say that I do," Ed said, shifting in the chair. "Not that I'm judging, mind, just not familiar with what you're describing." Something in his eyes and the tone of his voice led Toby to believe Ed was lying. It was the subtlest shift to survival mode through denial and diminishing. Toby wasn't going to argue, though. "I can't keep on like this. I need to do something before I hurt someone." Jesus. He rose, stalking to the far corner of the den with his beer. Suddenly, that little room seemed incredibly stifling to him, with its dim, 70s color scheme and old furniture that clung to its ghost like a dust shroud. "I can't take it anymore. I wish I could carve this whole part of me away, make those feelings just dry up." "And therapy?" Toby groaned. "It's useless, man, especially in the short term. You know that. And I'm frankly terrified a shrink will suggest the surgery. I guess maybe I could do the drugs, but the guys on the forum who are taking them seem so miserable or just numb to everything. And I don't want to be like that either. Plus, there are all these possible side effects, serious ones." He sighed. "I don't know what to do. I just want to be normal. I want the urges to go away. I'd do anything at this point. Christ, maybe I should be on those damn drugs." He shook his head. He felt lost. "Well, there is another way. No drugs, no surgery, and no therapy. But you have to be really sure, really clear in your own head about what you want. Is that what you really want?" Toby turned to the old man. Yeah, of course. Wouldn't you? I mean, if you could get rid of that part of you that feels what we feel for kids, wouldn't you cut it out of you? It's like a tumor, Ed. I'd just as soon be rid of it." Ed cleared his throat. His gaze was fixed on his beer bottle, but Toby knew he had something to say, hanging there just behind that unsmiling mouth. "What?" Toby prompted. "Well, there's the door." "What? What door?" "The door, you know." Ed gestured toward the window and beyond it, the edge of the forest. "The one out in the woods. The door." "I don't know what you're talking about, Ed. What? The door to what? And what does it have to do with me?" "Ain't no one ever told you about the door? For fuck's sake, how long have you lived in this town?" "Ed, what door?" Ed gazed at his beer for several seconds before answering. It's a door that gives you stuff. Or takes stuff away that you don't want anymore. Like, suppose your old lady is cheating on you with the guy down the street, right? Well, you go to the door, and you have to go alone, see at night, with a letter. You fold the letter and seal it with wax that has drops of your blood in it. And inside, the letter asks for your wife not to see the guy anymore. Or for the guy to just go away, right? Just up and disappear. And in 3 days, never heard of it taking no longer or shorter, you get what you want. Like the guy gets hit by a bus, maybe, or he just vanishes, no trace, just gone. You get your old lady back. Maybe. You're kidding me. But Toby could tell that the older man wasn't, just as he could see the predator behind Ed's grandfatherly eyes. Ed was serious. He believed what he was saying, whole cloth. Ed shook his head slowly. You ask any of the old folks around here, they'll tell you. The door is real. Go out, see for yourself. It's standing out there, plain as day, one of Zarephath's great unkept secrets. And it does work, just like I told you. You ask for something to be taken away, like your attraction of little girls there, and you will get what you want. Though I gotta say, it may not be like you think. And you can't take it back. You can't undo what you asked. And you sure as hell can't open the door. No matter what. No, sir. So you think a magic door is going to solve my problems? Is that what you're telling me? Ed shrugged. Poke fun all you want, but you go see if I'm telling tales. Go see. If it's so great and powerful, then why haven't you ever used the door? Ed gave him a faint smile. I'm an old man. Not much of a sex drive anymore. No real need. Besides, I guess when I was a younger man, I was selfish. Selfish and a little afraid of giving up the only thing I knew, only thing I was sure about. And, of course, the old folks at the time made sure I knew about the drawbacks, just as I guess I ought to make sure you know. Drawbacks? You don't get nothing for free, Toe. You know that. Like I've been trying to say, there's risk using that door. Always risk. He sipped his beer thoughtfully. Of course, it sounds like there's a mighty big risk to your not using it at this point, too. Guess it's up to you. Toby sat rolling the beer bottle between his hands as he considered what Ed had said. So what, I just write a letter, like to Santa Claus? Tell the store what I want? Then what? Then you seal it, like I said. Melt some wax, mix a little of your blood in, then seal it. Like those old-fashioned letters, you know? Toby nodded. Then you go out at night, has to be full dark, and you make your way to the door. How do I find it? What if I get lost? Toby broke in. Well, you can bring a flashlight and a compass or one of them app things on your phone if you got it. Okay, so assuming I find the door, then what? Then you slip the letter under the door. That's how I'd always heard it done. No words necessary, just slip it under, then walk away. Go home, keep your mouth shut. Deed is done. Toby frowned. The whole thing was crazy. Magic doors, wishes granted, fairy tales were for kids, not for men who exploited them. He shook his head. He wanted a solution to his problem more than anything, but this? Was Ed fucking with him? Ed seemed to read the doubt on his face and leaned forward, tipping the mouth of his beer at Toby like a pointing finger. Look, I know how it sounds. Believe me, I know. You don't have to take my word for it. If you want to consider using the door, I'll take you out there tomorrow afternoon. You can see it for yourself. If not, we can forget we ever had this conversation. You just said you were looking for a solution that wouldn't involve drugs or surgery or hurting any one of them pretty little girls in the park. This might be the only option you got, buddy. And that was chapter 1 of Behind the Door. Again, it's available on Amazon. It's on sale now for 99 cents. I hope you enjoyed it. And thanks again to Sadie for having me on the Celebrate Horror 2021. Bye.